Namaste, welcome to the Atharva Forum. Today I am going to present on Dr. Raghu Vira and his contributions towards developing Indian languages, including Indianization of scientific terms. After a brief introduction to Dr. Raghu Vira and his works, his views on importance of learning one's own mother tongue, we will look into the principles evolved by CSTT, which is the Commission for Science and Technical Terms, and flaws in those principles, as discussed by Dr. Raghu Vira. Then his principles, which he himself composed, and the dictionaries that he has brought out based on these principles that he produced, and the way forward. What should we do ahead with this work, and how should we take this work further? Before we proceed, for those who have not yet subscribed to the Atharva Forum, please click the subscribe button. Now I would like to introduce Dr. Raghu Vira and his works. He was born in 1902. He was a linguist, scholar, prominent politician, and a member of Constituent Assembly. He was one of the editors of the critical edition of the Mahabharata brought out by Bori. It's a famous critical edition. He was a nationalist and served as Janasang's president. The Indian National Congress recognized his linguistic expertise and elected him first to Constituent Assembly in 1948 and then to Rajya Sabha in 1952 and 1957. So he played his role in India's politics. He is quite famous for his great English-Hindi dictionary, where he coined about 1.5 to 2 lakh scientific words for use across various disciplines. He has kept all Indian languages in his mind while doing this work. An interesting facet of his life was he was very interested in the Eastern sphere and its connection with India. He traveled to China. It was a very tough journey. He actually went to Tunhuang, where there are caves with lots of manuscripts and artifacts. He visited a number of caves and 26 stupas of the 5 dynasty period. It's one of the dynasty periods of China. And when he visited different parts of the caves and other important places, he kept a detailed record. When he returned, he had lots of artifacts and manuscripts. In fact, he had 300 wooden boxes with him containing rarest of finds, antiques, and manuscripts bearing on the deep cultural relations between China and India. I myself have 2 of his books. One is Sanskrit Chinese Lexicon. There is a work called Fan Fan Yu, the first known lexicon of its kind from 517 Common Era. He has translated that, reconstructed it, and with notes he has published it. It's a wonderful contribution to Indo-Chinese studies. There is one more which I have. It's called Pentaglot Dictionary of Buddhist Terms, where he gives several terms in 5 languages: Sanskrit, Tibetan, Manchurian, Mongolian, and Chinese. I think it's one of those contributions which is unparalleled in our research as part of our country's heritage as well as our relations with other countries. He established the International Academy of Indian Culture. It was called as Saraswati Vihar during that time. It was his personal center for research work on Indian culture, literature, religion, and where he did research on India as well as its connections with Mongolia, Indonesia, China, and so on. It was established in Lahore in 1932, but he sensed trouble in 1946 and then shifted it to Nagpur before partition. The Vihar was later shifted to Delhi in 1956 and it is still functioning under his son, Dr. Lokesh Chandra. Now on to his views on disadvantages of English and importance of developing Bharatiya Bhashaha. It's ironic that I am presenting this in English, but I do feel that that is the relevant way to go, because this is very much needed for the English audience, English educated people, because of certain views they hold. And mainly I am presenting this talk based on his collected writings that was published recently by his son Lokesh Chandra. Dr. Raghuvira talks about the difference between earlier invaders of India and later invaders of India. It's an interesting topic because what he says is when the Greeks, Shakas, Hunas came to India, they settled down here, but they did not impose their languages on us. In fact, they mingled so much after a few generations, it was very difficult to even identify who they were amongst Indians. Today, even now, they live amongst us, but it's all impossible to even take apart and see who was the Huna, who has this gene, and so on. Maybe some scientists might do. They really mingled with the populace and adopted Indian culture. Whereas, in contrast to that, Muslims and the British, when they came, they started imposing their language as well as culture on India. Muslims imposed Persian, for example, and British not just imposed English, but in fact the education system. We all are very familiar with Macaulay's uh, system and what it did to India. What Dr. Raghuvira says here is English terms are a memory burden. I'll just read a quick quote from his writing. The process of Indianization should start in our education. Our schools and colleges are the manufactories for the mass outturn of officers for every department of the government. Here we face a mighty problem. It is the problem of specific terms that are the corpus of science. Without them, it would not be possible to change the medium of instruction. Within every term lies a concept, which our students would do well to grasp. English terms are mostly derived from Latin and Greek, which our students will never have the opportunity to learn. In terms of educational psychology, English terms are so much memory burden. It is not through understanding that Indian students can hope to retain them, but through sheer rote. So he always distinguished understanding versus rote memorization. And we are seeing the influence of English education in this area even till this day. Our languages, even though there are many in India, have a common source, which is Sanskrit. So technical terms will be derived from Samskrita. And in fact, if we talk about higher education, probably someone who has undergone higher education in Kannada, if he looks into books in Telugu in the same area, he can understand it because many technical terms overlap. But the normal language where the connecting words are there, that he may not be able to figure. So he has to learn only the basics of the language if the idea is to know technical literature of other languages within India. Then there is a question that comes up. If we have our own languages in higher education, then how will India interface with the world? This question seems trivial to me personally. What Raghuvira thinks is also that if we have these terms and our bhasha, our languages as medium of education, then the understanding is quicker. And if we really want to interact with the world, then those who amongst us will interact with the world, they can learn English. And why just English? We should be able to learn German, Mandarin, Japanese, because there are scientists who do original work in their own languages and publish in their own languages in their journals. So, people who are interacting with others, they can learn several foreign languages. And it is not a necessity for everyone, each and every person of this country. And he also emphatically says that English is not the language of the people. Even though I am talking in English, it is still a reality in India that English is not the common man's language. In fact, people who have studied up to 12th or even who have done their degree, they also are unable to speak fluently in this language because this is not their Matrubhasha. There also, I would like to quote from his writing. I have wended my way through numerous lands in the east and in the west. I am yet to find a country where people refuse to talk in their own language. Some of us are anxious to get ahead of others and to become leaders of the world. But can we? To be anything at all, we first must be ourselves. By ignoring ourselves, we only lose ourselves. There is no gain. Then he writes something which is interesting. Can anyone in the two houses of the Indian Parliament open his mouth and utter anything else but English? If he does, he is a brave man. If he does, so he does it after weeks of effort at accumulating enough courage for doing so. 100 faces turn to him. Voices rise, English, English. Thus have members and ministers been cowed down. English is the language of the Indian Parliament, of the Indian courts, of Indian administration, of Indian universities, and of Indian commerce. But it is definitely not the language of the people, and it shall not remain the language of our government. He writes most of his writings in 1940s, 50s, and maybe some of them in early 60s. But it is interesting to note that the sthitihi, the situation, has not really changed much in the past several decades. He goes on further to say how English is discouraged in India. Teachers who are teaching in English medium, they really don't want a change. So they discourage students. What they would say is, your child's life is ruined. To the parents of the child, they say this if you make them study in this medium. Instead of changing the medium and making employment available, this is what is happening. There is one more question in this regard where different mother tongues play different roles in each of our states. And if one person moves from one state to another, then how do we interact? How does this person fit in? This question, Dr. Raghuvira says, is not a really big question because it is similar to how European Union deals with it. If I have to go to Germany, then I have to learn German. If I have to work there, study there. Similarly, France, Spain. Then why not in India, within India? He also talks about source languages and languages that borrow from these. And it is important to learn about these source languages and the cultures that they have spawned, and literature that they have spawned, and so on. Sanskrit, he broadly divides them into 4 or 5. Sanskrit is one ecosystem where it serves India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and then partially Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Malaysia, Indonesia. It's a region where India has influenced a lot of vocabulary and even the culture. So it can still play a very good role. In fact, talks about soft power are on the rise these days. Sanskrit is one ecosystem, the other one is Chinese. Chinese covers, apart from China and Taiwan, obviously, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. It provides all the important words, scientific terms, all important terms to these languages. Greek and Latin, as we know, serve Europe, Americas, Australia, New Zealand, and even Africa. Africa might have its own languages, but then Greek and Latin have become the norm these days. Arabic is for the Middle East and the world of Islam. Persian could also play a role, but then Persian is also inundated with Arabic. He says that these languages, especially Sanskrit, Chinese, Greek, and Latin, and Arabic, are the source languages, and each has given rise to a cultural sphere and its own contributions in terms of thought, scientific achievements, and so on. Do we really want to give up all of this? Is his question. After presenting his thoughts, I would like to review briefly the principles evolved by CSTT, Commission for Science and Technology Terms. It's a body of central government and it was established several decades ago, maybe in the 1950s or 60s. It has several principles listed in its website. So I'll briefly go through how these are structured, what they are, and whether they are good for us or are they having any flaws. Now I will briefly go over the principles evolved by CSTT, which is a central government body, Commission for Science and Technology Terms. And their job is to create new technical words that can be applied and used in all of our languages, Indian languages. First is, international terms should be adopted in their current English forms as far as possible and transliterated in Hindi and other Indian languages according to their genius. And here they list what do they mean by international terms. Names of elements and compounds. Example, hydrogen, carbon dioxide, etc. Then units of weights measures like calorie, ampere, and so on. Terms based on proper names. Example, Marxism, Braille. The next in the category is binomial nomenclature in botany, zoology, geology, and so on. Constants, for example, P, G, T, which are used. These are abbreviations used in sciences. Words like radio, radar, electron, proton, etc., which have gained practically worldwide usage. What do they mean by this is, if you write in Hindi, Kannada, Telugu, it doesn't matter. Radar or electron or proton must be written the same way, just that the script may be different. So if I write it in Devanagari, it has to be proton, where I'll put p, ra, then matra, ta, n. So it's just a lipyantaram. Script should be different, script will be different, but then you should retain these terms. Then numerals, symbols, signs, formulae used in mathematics. These all are considered as international terms and they should all be retained in Indian languages. This body, which is CSTT, terms these as international terms, which is name based or numerals, symbols, then words like radar, electron. It is ironic that these words should not be translated and have to be kept as such, but words in Samskrtam or our bhashas, which we call non-translatables because of the concept involved in them, those can be translated. There is really no bar on translating our words. For example, the latest one I learned is the Nirajanam. Nirajanam is Karpura Nirajanam before our Devatas that we do. Now that word has been translated as lustration. I have never heard of this word, but each and every word, including words like samadhihi that are part of Ashtanga Yoga, has been translated into English by the Indologists. But words which are common, concept based, like electron proton, shouldn't be translated. And this rule is coming from a government body, Indian government body, which is funded by us taxpayers. So, this is the irony that we need to understand here. The second principle of this is the symbols will remain in international form written in Roman script. Before it was allowed, at least, that the electron proton can be there, but you can write it in your script. But the second principle says centimeter and all of this has to be in Roman script, but abbreviations may be in Devanagari. For example, the symbol cm for centimeter will be used as such in Hindi, but abbreviation of Devanagari may be in Devanagari script. This will apply to books for children and other popular works only, but in standard works of science and technology, international symbols only like CM, which is in Roman script, should be used. So this reels of an inferiority complex or trying to appease someone whom I don't know. The third principle, letters of Indian scripts may be used in geometrical figures. For example, ka, kha, we want. If we want to use these letters, that can be used. But only letters of Roman and Greek alphabets should be used in trigonometrical relations, example sin A, cos B, etc. So no freedom allowed when you are using trigonometrical relations. It's again an irony here. It is India that contributed trigonometry to the world. Jya, Kotik Jya has gone from India to the world, and now we cannot use our terms. Fourth principle is conceptual terms should be generally translated. Fifth, in the selection of Hindi equivalents, simplicity, precision of meaning, and easy intelligibility should be borne in mind. Obscurantism and purism may be avoided. This is a good point. Then the next, sixth, the aim should be to achieve maximum possible identity in all Indian languages by selecting terms. Though partially this can be accepted, we have to work on language by language basis, because one language may have a technical term that may mean something else elsewhere in another language. And if there are common roots from Samskritam that can be used, then those must be used. That is also recommended by CSTT. Then the seventh, indigenous terms which have come into vogue in our languages for certain technical words of common use should be retained. Here the examples given are Tara for telegram, Mahadvipaha for continent, and Daka for post. Here also we may face some issues because some regions have come up with these words based on their history. That may not fit into a language or linguistic idiom of another language. The next eighth point here says, such loan words from English, Portuguese, French as have gained wide currency in Indian languages should be retained. Example, ticket, signal, pension, police, restaurant, deluxe, etc. Now, this is a recipe for disaster because if we count such words, then they will inundate our languages. But this is a principle that they have adopted. Next principle, ninth, transliteration of international terms into Devanagari script. The transliteration of English terms should not be made so complex as to necessitate the introduction of new signs and symbols in the present Devanagari characters. Devanagari has a set of characters. The transliteration must be done within those letters. So the aim here is to just not proliferate more aksharas, but just to conserve them. The pronunciation part of it is not really considered, it's ignored. 10th principle is gender. The international terms adopted in Hindi should be used in masculine gender unless there are compelling reasons to the contrary. This needs some discussion, which may occur at some other point in time. 11th point, which I think will kill Indian languages, is this. Hybrid formation. Hybrid forms in technical terminologies. Example, guaranteed is the word in English. For that, the term recommended is garantita. Classical is an English word. For that, the word they recommend in our bhashas is classiki. Then there is a codifier who should be called kodakaraha. So what they say is hybrid forms in technical terminologies like this, garantita, classiki, kodakaraha, are normal and natural linguistic phenomena, and such forms may be adopted in practice keeping in view the requirements of technical terminology. Example, simplicity, utility and precision. So simplicity, utility and precision are the only concerns. All of these hybrid words are allowed. 12th is sandhi and samasa. Complex forms of sandhi may be avoided in case of compound words, and hyphen may be placed between two terms if the samasa is bigger. 13th is halant prayogaha. Newly adopted terms should be correctly rendered with the use of hal wherever necessary. Halanta is just a stop. For example, hal, kach. So the stop is called halanta. They recommend it for some purpose. The last principle is use of panchama varna. The use of anuswara may be preferred in the place of panchama varna. For example, transliteration of lens and patent. The example itself is very revealing. Lens should be translated as lens and not lens. When you write in Devanagari, le and then a dot and sa. That is not what is recommended, whereas lens is recommended. We have seen these principles. I think many of you might be thinking that not all of these principles are good, or some of them are actually detrimental to the development of our languages. I'll quickly introduce Dr. Raghu Vira's thoughts on these principles. I think not all of these principles were put out when he was still working in this field. So he has mainly critiqued 3 points. So one is international terms. So the first principle here stated before was that international terms should be retained in English. What Raghuvira says is this. Scientific terms in Western countries have not been framed by any council. We tend to think by looking at names like IUPAC and other bodies that all of it is centrally managed. While that may be the case now, it was not an organic process before. In fact, scientists were working on their own, and then using their own languages, they coined scientific terms. Only there was a conflict, there was a body needed to resolve the conflict. And Dr. Raghuvira also says, interestingly, these international terms are called international terms by some people. International contracts are never unilateral but bilateral or multilateral. No agreement is binding on a country unless it has participated in it on equal terms. India was never invited to participate in the naming of any of this. No representative of Hindi or any other Indian language has ever worked in any of these councils for generating technical terms. So, why are these terms binding on us? How can these be binding on us? International is not the same as universal. So, the word international may be used, but does it mean universal? So, the Latin sphere uses it, which is Europe, Americas, and these other countries. But for example, if we go to the Eastern sphere, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, all these languages, they use their own technical terms, which is mostly based out of China and sometimes generated in Japan and back imported into China. For them, that is international. And similarly, he says, if we put our own efforts and provide terms, come up with terms from Sanskritam, Pali, Prakritam, and our own languages, those will definitely be used in Southeast Asia, as is the case for a long time. In those cases, our terms will also become international terms. So, this international term that is being used to convince us is not really a convincing reason. He comments on one more principle, which is as far as possible, international terms and technical terms should be used in our books in the sense of geology, zoology, binomial nomenclature, and these terms that are again called international terms. Here he makes a very important point where he says general purpose words in scientific works are less in number. Connecting words and normal words which other people will understand, common people will understand. But when it comes to scientific terms, in scientific works, scientific terms only occupy a lot of space, and connecting words are lesser in number. So, what he says is technical words dominate, and a weak framework of language, which is Hindi or Telugu, where most, if not all, technical terms through being called as international terms are Latin and Greek based, are undertaken, then the weight of those terms cannot be borne by our languages, which essentially means our languages will anyway be phased out, and even those connecting words will be English, which is actually what has happened now in India. And when these technical terms are the terms that are important and are difficult for our students, and there is a lot of time wasted in learning a foreign language and an idiom and scientific terms that are very difficult for our students, then why should we pursue them? He gives an example of the word monocotyledonous. It's a biological term. When a child goes to school and his biology class starts, within a few lessons he will encounter such terms and many such terms. He has to rote memorize these words, has to understand them and still not forget, and his pronunciation may be ridiculed by others whom themselves have some accent. Instead, he says if we use the word eka bija patram, eka everyone understands, bijam also most people understand, patram most people understand. So it's eka bija patram. Isn't it that simple? Why do we have to stick on to monocotyledonous, which is difficult to pronounce and difficult to even memorize and retain? Another example he has given is telepathy. Now, does this word have a structure? It does. Tele and pati. And does it have any other relative words? Obviously, it has. He gives some examples: telescope, television, telephone, teleprinter, etc. Consider this scenario. If we are translating from English or any other language to our languages, if a sentence has the word distant or distance, would we translate into our languages? Yes, we would. Maybe duram, dura, or one of these words would be used. Now, in television or telescope, also the word distant is there, but in the form of tele. His question is, when you translate individual words into our own languages, why are we not translating when they are part of a samasa, which is a compound word? Now, television is a compound word and it is actually out of Greek and Latin. Telephone And all these words are also compound words, where the component tele means just distant. When it is part of a compound, suddenly where does the translation effort disappear suddenly? Or why does the necessity suddenly disappear? In fact, he argues that if there are such words, these have to be translated. These have to be translated more than other words because these are more opaque, because our students do not have any idea of Greek and Latin. He responds to one more point of CSTT principles, which is symbols, signs, etc. have to be retained, including weights, measures, and constants. For example, G, capital G is used for gravitational constant, small g is used for the value of acceleration due to gravity. And in general, in geometry, point is denoted by O or P. M stands for mass. Here, what he says is these carry their own terminology. I don't generally write P for a point. I write P for a point because it's an abbreviation of the word point, which is P, the beginning letter of which is P. So all of these abbreviations carry their own ideas, and it is based on the actual language and its usage. So if we want to use the word binduhu, for example, then B or ba should be used in our languages for this. Personally speaking, I saw some books recently where around 70 years ago, some scholars had published on Bhaskaracharya's texts, Siddhanta Shiromani. And here I could not find any other symbol or letter other than Devanagari. And the discussion is extremely detailed. He gives everything that one needs to do and understand, but all of it is in Samskritam and Devanagari. Similar thing can be very easily achieved for any of our regional bhashas. Raghuvira also talks about United Nations Atomic Energy Commission publication. It's an example he wants to give where this publication talks about nuclear fission in 5 languages: English, French, Spanish, Russian, and Chinese. Here, United Nations objective is not to do a universalization of English terms or international terms. They are very careful that they should publish this in all the 5 languages, and that is when all of these languages will be held in proper position and everyone can equally contribute. And in this, he gives examples of some Chinese terms. For example, proton, Chinese translate as zhizi, neutron is zhongzi, and electron is tianzi. I have personally looked into Chinese dictionaries. Each and every term used in any particular scientific or technological discipline is thoroughly translated according to the meaning. Japanese have also done this after Meiji Restoration in 1867. In fact, what they have done is they have systematically translated all technical terms from the West into their own languages according to their own principles, and they have made this science very homely so that it gives a feeling that it is us, it is for us, and we are doing science and technology, which we have not been able to do and we still lag behind. In fact, English is one of the major roadblocks for advancement of our country. This point has been recently discussed by other authors also. Another interesting point in this regard is this: we generally find a hesitation for going into science movies or sci-fi movies or subjects relating to science and technology in Indian movies. I always wondered about this and why this must be the case. I think it has got something to do with the fact that we have not internalized it as part of our languages. Because our movies come up in Hindi or Telugu or Kannada, Tamil. If you have to deal with a sci-fi subject or a scientific subject, then the movie will be inundated with English words because we have not made the effort to coin new words in our languages. So what happens here is naturally it sounds pedantic or it repels the audience, and even the people who are writing the script here think that this may not be a suitable topic. So there are these kinds of pop culture influences or pop culture also gets affected because of our lack of words. After his comment on these principles by CSTT, Dr. Raghuvira concludes, in fact, he asks a rhetoric question and concludes, are these principles for development of Indian languages, or are they for negating Indian terms? Or are they for negating Indian terms and languages? So this is something we need to think about, because if you have been listening to the presentation of the principles, it is a very lazy attempt, and it really doesn't have any purpose in furthering our languages or medium of our education. Now I'll go on to Dr. Raghuvira's principles that he has evolved and some of the dictionaries that he has published. 1947-1954 time period, he came up with some of these dictionaries. The first one was Vanijya Shabdakoshaha. It's a dictionary of commerce with special reference to bookkeeping and accountancy. Sankhiki Shabdakoshaha. It's a dictionary on statistics. I did have a look at it. It's a very useful dictionary. It's a short one, but it's very useful if you really want to write about statistical topics in Indian languages. He also has an Arthashastra Shabdakoshaha. Arthashastram is a well-known work of Kautilya, but we really do need terms to talk about current events. He has compiled a dictionary on this topic and a terminology dictionary of logic, a dictionary of English Indian terms on administration. He has done a very wonderful work on scientific nomenclature, Indian scientific nomenclature of birds of India, Burma, and Ceylon. Here he has given binomial nomenclature and trinomial nomenclature of birds in these countries. It's a very wonderful way of evolving scientific terminology across disciplines, because this is usually considered to be one of the tough areas. He has also published a book on scientific nomenclature of mammals in India, Burma, and Ceylon. After publishing such individual koshas, what he did is consolidated all of this and published a great consolidated English Indian dictionary, where several terms, probably around 80,000, 1 lakh terms, or probably even more, on various disciplines like anatomy, botany, chemistry, insurance, news, newspapers, mineralogy, medicine, mathematics, pharmacy, physics, whatever important disciplines were there during that time, he has tried to give all important words in these areas, and he has collected them in this dictionary. And in fact, he has also published a Hindi-English dictionary of technical terms. Another one of his is Indian conventional signs for topographical maps of the survey of India. He has done a lot of work. It's a huge contribution. It's a huge contribution to our languages. Without this, it's very difficult to write very clearly about current topics and technological topics. Now that we know about some of the work that he has done, we can also look into the principles, general principles that he used to come up with the words. And I'll also give some examples of the words that he has come up with. One word conveys only one primary meaning. Then words are anvartha significant, which means they point to some salient feature of the object that is being translated. This is very important because what happens with English words based on Latin and Greek is the words are very opaque to us. We can't understand really what these mean unless being told, and again you have to rote memorize them. But if these words have components which we know about, then they already carry a pointer to the meaning. The third principle he has is simple English words are translated by simple words and not compound words. We really don't want to increase the size of our words. So he has adopted this principle. The length of the simple uncompounded word is kept strictly within bounds. 2 and 3 syllables is the norm. Then distinctive prefixes and suffixes of a particular branch of knowledge are normally used. And they are translated with this as a device. He gives some interesting examples. Perimeter, subgenus, are some of the words. Antimeter is also a word. So for perimeter, you can use parimapaha. Even though already there is a word paridhihi, parinahaha that have already been used, but peri is cognate with pari. Similarly, sub is cognate with anu. Anti, wherever the word anti occurs, prati is a good upasarga. Upasarga is a prefix that can be used. So distinctive prefixes and suffixes he is selecting. In fact, he enumerates some of them and he uses in his constructions. This is an example that he gives for prefixes. The suffix example is very interesting. He has coined a word for phosphorus, which is bhaswaraha, or rather, bhaswaraha might have been the origin for phosphorus. That is also possible. So, phosphorus is bhaswaraha. Now, how do we say phosphate, phosphated, phosphatic, phosphatide, phosphatide, phosphation, and words like this? For this, he uses suffixes. Bhasviya would be phosphate. Bhasvita would be phosphated. Bhasvika would be phosphatic, and so on. There are other words that can be derived from suffixes. Bhasveya, Bhasvi, Bhasvika, Bhasvaika, and so on. So he thinks about them as a group, not just an individual word. Next principle is, if a term in English has a number of distinctive derivatives, all of them are provided for. It is essentially similar to the one that I already mentioned, but slightly extending this. Law is vidhihi, but then lawful also needs to be given, which is vidhivat or vidhisangata. But also words like legal, illegal, legislation, legislative, lawless, all these words are also provided for in the dictionary. Where needed, a word is allowed one or more abridged forms. This is seen commonly in the words that we use today. For example, oxygen is a word, oxychloride is another word, oxypurin, oxyketone, and words like this have an abbreviated form of oxygen. He says there is a similar way we can do. For example, oxygen is jarakaha. By the way, this word jarakaha is from very old usage in Indian languages. Here he says jara can be used as a prefix. If we have to use something like oxyketone, oxy, if the word part oxy has to be used in a word, then jara can be used. He has come up with 92 names for the 92 elements that existed during his time. For the complete periodic table, for each of the elements, he has come up with a name based on Samskrtam, and he gives the reason why he has chosen this. Each of the name is based on a property. For example, bhuyatihi means nitrogen. The reasoning behind the name is it is bhuyishtam. Bhuyishtam means it is present more than any other gas in Earth's atmosphere, 78 odd percentage. So he has coined the word bhuyatihi. Similarly, he has also coined for each of the 92 elements. He also uses a technique to coin these names. For example, if it is a gas, he uses a suffix called atihi from vatihi. Vatihi means air in Sanskrit. So he abbreviates it and uses atihi for elements that are gases. And dhatuhu is a term which is a very ancient term for any mineral and compounds. He uses the word dhatuhu and takes the portion atuhu to coin new names based on some other property also. These are some of the considerations he has. Then the next principle he enumerates is no word is considered and translated individually. It is taken along with its grammatical derivatives like nouns, verbs, etc. Swarna is aurum. In chemistry, Au is what is used, even though the normal term is gold. But then if you want to use auric, then he says swarnika, aurus, swarnia. He gives more examples of this from even biology and other disciplines. In case of ideas and objects that have existed from ancient times, old names are assiduously hunted out from the vast range of Sanskrit, Pali, and Prakrit literatures. Modern Indian languages are also consulted. I saw an example of this in his own work. for a toll booth, if I am not wrong, he has coined a word from a Prakrit language. This Prakrit was used in Kuchinam, which was called Kuchia also in English. Now it corresponds to the Xinjiang province of China, northwest China. There was a Prakritam when Xuanzang and other travelers traveled through that area. There was actually a Prakrita Bhasha that the locals spoke in that area. And he thought that a word there is most suitable for a toll gate, even though Samskritam also has words for toll gate. So he has done this. It's a very important principle to keep in mind. Another example that I found where he uses an ancient term as against a modern term is oxygen. Oxygen, amlajanaka, is being used, which is a direct translation of the word oxygen, whereas he has used the word jarakaha. Jarakaha, Jaranam, these are words used in our Rasayana Shastram. So, what he says is, if we already have a word, why invent a new word? It's a Pramanikam Padam. It has been used for thousands, if not more, of years, thousands of years in our literature. So, let us use these terms. Any word that has been coined is useful for us. Recently, I also noticed one example where Dr. Raghuvira had coined a word Kshitija Chapaha. Kshitija Chapaha for azimuth. It's a concept in astronomy, navigation, and other such allied sciences, where he has coined the word Kshitija Chapaha. By his own principles, he would change, because I learnt that the word azimuth is used in our own Shastras and the word is Udagra. So, in such cases, we'll have to adopt these words. For new ideas, new suffixes have been devised. This is the 11th principle. I briefly explained using dhatuhu and vatihi. He has also used la as a suffix. La is abridged from virala. So if there is a rare element or something rare about a gas or an element, then he uses the suffix la for this. Next principle, phonetically every word is designed to fit in with the Indian genius. Harsh sounds and awkward consonant combinations are avoided. This principle cannot be followed if we are deliberately hanging on to Latin and Greek based words. In fact, the result of this is quite clearly seen in recent publications where only the script has been changed. And I read something like anatomy for anatomy, and the book has no real impact because all the words are Latin Greek based scientific words, but just in Devanagari. The whole exercise here is to make it Indian, and this should be our bhasha. Then we have achieved something. Next principle is our words are usable in Hindi and most other languages of North, South, East, and West of India. Since there is already an ecosystem here where Samskritam is a source, Samskritam, Prakritam are the sources, this should be less of a problem. But whenever the need arises, individual koshakaras in their own languages can have their own words. The last principle, main principle that he has written here is technical terms are a supplement to the general dictionary. While the technical dictionary adds to the existing language and in a technical way modifies it, all the same it does not replace the words of the general language. The higher one ascends, the more one uses technical terms, special terms. But in everyday speech and writing, the common language will continue more or less as it is today. In fact, if we really want the common language to continue, then we have to provide for technical terms. Otherwise, even this will be taken out and then English will replace common language also, like what I observe in Bengaluru and probably other metropolitan cities of India. I talked about the dictionaries that he has published and the principles. Now I'll give you a few more examples of the words that he has come up with. Carbon dioxide. Prangara dvijareyaha. So oxygen is jarakaha. Jareyaha will be oxide. So it's all related. And it has been similarly evolved in Greek, Latin, and other European languages. So why not our own languages? Carbon is prangaraha. Angarakaha is coal. Prangara it is derived from coal. So prangara dvijareyaha. If it is carbon monoxide, you just have to say prangara jareyaha. Sodium chloride will be ksharatu nireyaha. It is just a matter of learning and abhyasa. You can easily relate to these terms. Now the question will arise, if there is a very long word, technical word, can these be achieved? It can be achieved. One example I would like to give is again from chemistry, sodium phenyl hydrazine p sulfonate. Here he translates it as Ksharatu Darshala Udajivi Pashulbaiya. So each of these terms has a equivalent here, and the equivalent is based on a very clear principle, and it has something behind it. So once we learn a basic word, its forms are easier to remember. Interestingly, I found one of his koshas, chemistry dictionary in Aksharam, Bengaluru. Somehow it has landed there. It is one of the only individual dictionaries that I found. Uh, and I was very happy to find it because he has compiled all chemical nomenclature in this dictionary. Similarly, he has done with all different fields, and these have to be updated. Next question is there any writing using these words or dictionaries? In fact, Dr. Raghuvira says in this dictionary introduction that currently meaning around 1950s, it must be, several books are being published in Hindi and Marathi on physics, chemistry, biology, coordinate geometry, and various other high school, middle school books are being published. And I think even BSc, BA books are being published or under preparation. It is either published or under preparation, where these terms, technical terms coined by him and his team, are being used. I am yet to trace these dictionaries. I think I might have to travel to Nagpur or Delhi, but these are treasures that we must retrieve and use. Since I don't have access to any of these, I made my own attempt to write some technical paragraphs in Samskritam. This can be done in any other language, including Hindi, Telugu, Marathi, Kannada. I'll give you a sample of what I wrote. This is on Pravarshanam, which is rainfall. You will see the text and basic translation as and when I read. Adityasya tejasa sagaradishu jalashayeshu vidyamanasya jalasya kaschana bhagaha jalabashparupena parinamati. द्रवस्य वातिरूपेण परिवर्तनमिदम् उद्बाष्पणम् इत्यभिधीयते. वातिः द्रवस्यापेक्षया न्यूनभारः, अतः अन्तरिक्षं प्रति उद्गच्छति. तत्र न्यूनतापमानात् जलबाष्पं पुनः सूक्ष्मजलबिन्दुकाः भवति. वातेः द्रवरूपेण परिवर्तनविधेयं सङ्घननम् इत्यभिधीयते. सङ्घननम् उद्बाष्पस्य विलोमविधा अस्ति. सङ्घननेन मेघाः उत्पद्यन्ते वर्धन्ते च. संहताः जलबिन्दुकाः बिन्दवः भवन्ति. संहताः बिन्दवः बृहद्बिन्दवः भवन्ति. ततः गुरुत्वात् भू आकृष्ट्या भूमौ पतन्ति. इयं वृष्टिरित्यभिधीयते. यदि मेघः शीतलतरः तर्हि जलबिन्दुकाः श्यात्वा हिमः भवन्ति. इमे हिमस्फटाः मेघतापमानं भूतापमानं च अवलम्ब्य शीनकरकवृष्टिरूपेण भूमौ पतन्ति. As you can see, the process of precipitation, cloud formation, and how they change into various forms, including snow, etc., can be easily written in such a language in Sanskritam. The same words can be used, and the pratyaya and the language can be their own. For example, a Marathi person can use these terms but write using normal Marathi. It can be very easily understood. One more example that I wrote is about proton-neutron, since that came up in his writing, and how nuclear fission terminologies were used in the UN publication, and Chinese have their own terms. Similarly, why can't we? And the principle of CSTT says proton, neutron, these terms have been commonly accepted, so we should accept them. But this is unnecessary. Pranuhu is a good translation for proton. Klebanuhu is a good one for neutron. Vidyudanuhu is a good one for electron. So if we want to describe an electronic structure, if we want to describe the structure of an electron, then this can be how it can be written. This is one of the ways. Sarve Paramanavaha, I am using the word Paramanuhu for atom. Sarve Paramanavaha प्राणु क्लीबाणु विद्युदण्वाख्यैः अन्तः परमाण्विकैः लवैः निर्मिताः प्रत्येकस्मिन् परमाणौ नाभिगतां न्यष्टिं परितः विद्युदणवः परिभ्रमन्ति. So I talked about the three major particles, fundamental particles inside an atom. Next, if you also want to talk about their mass and charge, those can also be written. Pranunam klibanunam cha punjah samanah. Tesham sanyukta punjah eva paramanoho punjah. Vidyudanavah atyartham laghavah sukshmaha shunya punjaha iva. Pranavah dhanaprabharaha क्लीबाणवः शून्यप्रभाराः विद्युदणवः ऋणप्रभाराश्च. As you can see, all of these basic concepts can be expressed in our languages. I am using Sanskrit as an example because I write in this language. When it is easy to write in our own languages, including our own terminology, why do we have to stick with foreign terms which don't fit into the idiom of our languages? This is the question. I gave examples about phosphorus before. Similarly, I could also locate about nitrogen, which he writes as bhuyatihi. If you want to talk about nitrite, bhuyitam, nitrate, bhuyiyam, nitrous oxide, bhuyiya jareyah, nitric oxide, bhuyika jareyah. Since I am writing in this area, it is more chemistry focused, but he has coined terms for almost all areas of knowledge, including geology and latest technology that he was aware of during his time. But the question remains that we have to update this kosha. Now that I talked about the principles of CSTT and the critique of Dr. Raghu Vira on them, and his own principles and contributions, I would like to have a small conclusion discussing on the way forward. We understand the issue, which is inundation with English language and destruction of our Matrubhasha. If we consider the scenario today, what happens is, you cannot go and tell children that just for reading Bhagavad Gita, Mahabharatam, you learn Kannada. Even though we don't express it, there is a natural thinking that whatever is useful is in English. And in fact, Bhagavad Gita, Mahabharatam, all have been translated into English. So I know English. Why should I read Kannada? Why should I talk about Kannada? There is no need of this. Even though people who have studied these know that reading the original is not at all comparable to reading a translation. But it is interesting that the usefulness of a language in expressing current ideas and knowledge definitely plays a very important role in deciding the importance of a language and even other areas of a language that will be taken up by future generations. Coming to the way forward here, since the principles of CSTT are faulty, as we saw, and it cannot give us any short-term benefit or even long-term benefit, we have to revise the principles and get several teams to work on it. In fact, we may need more than 500, 600 teams based on so many areas that are identified. There are so many dictionaries published in the website of CSTT, but I have taken a look at them. They are not really useful. There are many hybrid words and very lazily translated words that cannot really serve the purpose of our scientific development and expression. It is not a meager task. It's extremely difficult in the sense that the science and technology terminology has advanced so much in the last few decades that it has become very, very difficult at the moment to update it, but it can be done. It may take a decade of work, but it can be done. But nothing effective has been undertaken till now. So this is the area that has to be pushed through. Here, Dr. Raghuvira's kosha that has already been printed and now they have been scanned will be of utmost help. But the sad situation here is that the scans available of his work are very faulty. Pages are missing or they are jumbled up. Many of the koshas have not been scanned. In fact, I am unable to trace many of the individual koshas. Some of them have come to light, but many of them are lying either in old libraries or with his son Lokesh Chandra in Delhi. So digitization of his koshas also need to be done, and his principles have to be considered while we revise our principles for generating effective words. And when this is done, or this is being done, we should also deploy these words. Just having a dictionary isn't helpful. So similar to some snippets that I read out before, we have to work through magazines, writing articles and publishing, and we should also conduct workshops at various levels. One at a popular level to just popularize them, and there should be technical workshops where writers of these languages, technical writers of these languages, should be made aware of these works and how to use them, and some samples can also be introduced in these workshops. Recently, an idea called crowdsourcing with respect to generating words is floating around. I don't think it's a very effective way to generate words, because thousand people will say thousand things, but we have to form an effective committee of scholars where, for example, there are scholars who are experts in a particular language. If we want to deal with Samskrtam first, then in Samskrtam, then there should be a Vayyakarana, then there should be an expert, domain expert. If we want to do an updated version of physics dictionary, then an expert in physics who has some inclination towards this work and also has a basic knowledge of Sanskrit should sit in this team, and they should work together to get uh, all the words that are in use today, in all the words that are used in technical works and papers today. The basis for all of this must be Sanskrit. All other languages derive their words from Sanskrit. Sanskritam is the source. Sanskrit, Pali, Prakritam can be sources. If we prepare these koshas for Samskritam, then those can be given as an input to other language koshakaraha, and they can take how much ever they want from this. And if they find a more suitable word in their languages for a particular technical term, then they can use that instead of the Sanskrit word in their dictionaries. This way, what would happen is each language will be taken care of, and a committee of that particular language experts will decide on what words they use. And there will be no imposition, because if we do a dictionary in Sanskritam and ask people to impose or implement these, it will become an imposition. So let this be an input and they can generate their own words. And if this process is followed, slowly we can gain more viewers, students for this particular work who will join this research work as well as use this work, use these dictionaries to write more and more. Unless and until we do this, English will be the default language in India in sciences and higher studies. And there is no way we can claim our civilization, and our thinking will be limited by how much we can learn in English, and the English culture will keep influencing us. The word decolonization is being used a lot these days, but since this project, undertaken by Dr. Raghu Vira more than 60, 70 years ago, is such an important part of this, this should not be forgotten. It has to be taken further. And I hope the viewers here and the government can do something about this project. Thank you.